He thought his badge made him untouchable, until he brought the wrong woman to court. He thought his badge made him untouchable, until he dragged the wrong woman out of her car on a quiet road in the middle of the night. A gripping and dramatic story is about to unfold. To continue following the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to Black Strength Stories so you won't miss our next powerful, real-life tales. It was Wednesday night, close to 11:40 p.m., when most streets surrounding Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport had already fallen silent. Yellow streetlights cast their glow onto asphalt still damp from the evening rain, reflecting long streaks like faint claw marks left by memories not yet put to rest. This was the hour when night shift workers had just clocked out, the final flights had taken off, and the city seemed to be retreating from itself. A black SUV bearing government plates crept through the Camp Creek Parkway intersection. Behind the wheel sat a woman who was not remarkable at first glance. But every silent step in her life, she had written a resume that would make any rookie at Fort Moore snap to attention. Lieutenant Colonel Cheryl Acacia, 22 years of military service, twice deployed to Afghanistan, former commander of convoy missions through conflict zones in Kandahar, coordinator of disaster logistics in Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina, was now just a soldier heading back to base after a 6-hour strategic meeting. Cheryl didn't play music. She didn't check her phone. She drove with the intuition of someone used to seeing through two lenses, the rearview mirror and instinct. In the car, there was nothing out of the ordinary, except a thick 76-page report on fuel distribution strategy across states, standard logistical work for someone in her role. But tonight, she didn't know that this very lack of anything special would become the reason she was targeted. From the left, a white flash burst. A siren ripped through the stillness. Her rearview mirror lit up with flashing red and blue. A patrol car barreling toward her like it was chasing an escaped fugitive. Cheryl didn't panic. She simply furrowed her brow, eased off the gas, and steered right, pulling over just as she had trained hundreds of recruits to do. The police cruiser stopped about 3 meters behind her vehicle. Its headlights beamed straight into her rearview mirror. A door slammed open, loud as a gavel strike. A man nearly 6'3" with broad shoulders approached, his right hand hovering near his holster, his left gripping a flashlight aimed directly ahead. No greeting, no identification. No, "Good evening. Do you know why I pulled you over?" Just one curt sentence. "Papers." Now. Though dressed in civilian clothes, Cheryl maintained the bearing of a soldier. No defiance, no debate. She replied calmly, "Officer, may I ask the reason I've been pulled over?" The flashlight shone directly into her eyes. The man, later identified as Sergeant Theophilus Enda from the South Atlanta Patrol Unit, spoke with a voice cold as iron on stone. "You were swerving. No turn signal. You seem impaired." Cheryl tilted her head slightly, not arguing. She opened the glove compartment, retrieved her driver's license, registration, and a government ID card, clearly stating in bold, USARMY, ACTIVEDUTY, CHERYL, ACACIA, LTCOLONEL. She passed them through the half-open window. Enda took them, glanced down for a second, then looked up with a crooked smirk. "Military? Doesn't matter. You still follow the law like everyone else." That sentence rang out clearly in the midnight air, not as a reminder, but as a declaration of dominance. And to Cheryl, it was a warning bell. This man didn't care who she was. He only cared that she wasn't bowing her head. She didn't know that, in just a few minutes, her composure, and her habit of recording everything, would become the shield for a legal battle that was never meant to happen. Because she wasn't simply a woman pulled over at night. She was living proof of this question. What happens when irresponsible power collides with a woman who knows exactly what she's worth. He didn't see a woman. He saw someone who dared to challenge his authority. And to him, that was reason enough to act as though the law was just a side note to the badge on his chest. Less than 30 seconds after taking Cheryl Acacia's documents, Sergeant Theophilus Enda escalated the situation, not because of any threat, but because her calm demeanor made him impatient. In Enda's mind, people who stayed too composed usually had something to hide, or worse, lacked the proper respect for authority. "Out of the vehicle," he said, louder this time, voice heavy with pressure. There was no alert from dispatch, no backup from fellow officers, and no justifiable reason to order a cooperative woman with government identification to step out of her car. But Cheryl complied anyway. No complaints, no eye-rolling, no hesitation. Just one subtle move. She opened her phone, silently turned on the camera, placed it on the dashboard, and whispered, "This is evidence." That action wasn't out of fear. It was preparation from someone who had seen senseless situations spiral into violence because of a question deemed provocative. She stepped out of the car, stood tall, arms resting calmly at her sides, a posture that wasn't defiant, but unmistakably firm. Enda motioned for her to move into the area lit by a street lamp and began the standardized walk and turn sobriety test. A soldier who had deployed twice, trekked through desert heat in 12-kilogram boots, and carried an 18-kilogram pack, wasn't going to stumble on a concrete sidewalk. Cheryl took 10 steps in a straight line, as precisely as a drill command, pivoted at a perfect 180 degrees, and repeated the process. No missteps, no tremors. Her breathing was steady. Her stance was so composed that it looked like a parade formation, not a criminal suspicion. Enda stepped back, his gun still holstered, flashlight locked on her every move. When the test ended, he said nothing. No, thank you. No, sorry for the inconvenience. He simply pulled out his pad and began writing a ticket. Offense: failure to maintain lane, exhibited signs of erratic driving. Cheryl watched him write, her eyes not angry, but cold, focused, and piercing, analyzing the architecture of a growing mistake. She said nothing, accepted the ticket, returned to her vehicle, started the engine, and drove off, just as she had arrived, composed and unshaken. At 1:13 a.m., Enda returned to the station. He plugged in his body cam for charging, typed a brief note into the report log. Field sobriety test. No criminal conduct. Issued civil citation. Then he shut the laptop, tossed the notepad onto the desk, and entered the break room, where a few officers were munching on snacks and watching TV. "What's up, Enda?" someone asked. Enda leaned back into a chair, smirking as if he'd just won a game no one cared about. "Some army lady flashed her government ID like she was the state commander. Thought I'd just let her go." The room burst into laughter. Some chuckled politely. Others nodded, as if to agree that maintaining order sometimes meant teaching someone a lesson. But one person didn't laugh. Officer Sophia Diaz, a rookie just 3 years out of the academy, formerly a top graduate of the Georgia State Police Institute. She looked straight at Enda, her expression unmoved. "What was her name?" Diaz asked. Enda crunched a chip, lazily replied, "Cheryl. Cheryl Acacia, I think. Said that on the card." Diaz went quiet for a few seconds, her eyes narrowing slightly. That name wasn't unfamiliar. She had once sat in on a guest lecture at the Atlanta Security Institute, just a year prior. Topic: high-level logistics in battlefield management. Guest speaker: Lieutenant Colonel Cheryl Acacia, the very woman Enda had just mocked. And in that fleeting moment, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. Enda's sneering laughter began to echo back, no longer as amusement, but as the reverberation of a mistake flapping its wings into a coming storm. The next morning, while most of Atlanta was still half asleep, Officer Sophia Diaz logged into the internal network and searched for the name Cheryl Acacia in the linked military database. The results appeared in less than 0.8 seconds, but the name didn't show up in just one record. It was in an entire chain. Lieutenant Colonel Cheryl Acacia, U.S. Army Logistics Command, Fort Moore, Georgia. 2 deployments to Afghanistan, former commander of the Strategic Food Transport Unit in Kandahar, recipient of the Defense Meritorious Service Medal, and most importantly, a guest lecturer on supply chains and organizational discipline in crisis zones at the Georgia State Security Institute. Sophia Diaz had sat in the 3rd row during that very lecture. Meanwhile, at Fort Moore, the first internal report landed on the desk of Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Kennard, Military Legal Liaison. It read, Civilian Agency Violation Report concerning military personnel. Affected officer, Lieutenant Column Cheryl Acacia. The incident occurred in South Atlanta. Video evidence pending verification. The 5-minute and 34-second video recorded from Cheryl's phone was promptly forwarded to the Office of the Inspector General of the U.S. Army, along with a detailed incident report, time-stamped to the second. The clip clearly showed threatening language, a domineering attitude, legally unfounded field sobriety testing, and the dismissal of government-issued identification. Within 24 hours, copies of the video were sent simultaneously to 2 locations, the Military Legal Office at Fort Moore and the Office of Police Ethics and Conduct within the Atlanta Police Department. Cheryl had not posted anything online, had not contacted the press, had not made a single public statement. She simply followed protocol. Her silence wasn't avoidance. It was discipline. The discipline of a soldier who never lets emotion override strategy. Rather than react impulsively, she proceeded step by step. Report, verify, document, submit. Each step bore an official stamp, and each line had a date, time, and signature. 3 days after the incident, at the headquarters of the South Atlanta Patrol Unit, a plain manila envelope, no red stamp, no urgent label, was placed on the front desk. Recipient, Sergeant Theophilus Enda. Enclosed, an official subpoena from the Fulton County Civil Court. Details. Case, Acacia versus Enda. Violation of civil rights under the 4th and 14th Amendments. Allegations, unlawful detention, intimidation through threat of force, and abuse of authority under the color of law. When Enda received the notice, he had just stepped into the break room with an iced coffee in hand. He tore open the envelope, skimmed a few lines, and burst out laughing. Not a chance, he scoffed. In his mind, a civil citation couldn't possibly lead to a lawsuit of consequence. To him, this was just a woman trying to make noise to save face. What he didn't know was that on the other side, Cheryl had already retained 3 legal advisors, a military attorney, a representative from the Inspector General's office, and a former federal prosecutor who had handled over 200 civil rights lawsuits. She wasn't looking for an apology. She was constructing a case to deliver a powerful message. The system can no longer protect those who wear the badge without integrity. And down the hall, Officer Sophia Diaz silently printed a copy of Cheryl Acacia's personnel record and placed it on the commanding officer's desk, because she knew this battle wasn't just about a midnight traffic stop. It was a confrontation between the so-called untouchable authority and the resolve of a woman who had worn her uniform for 22 years. At 8:15 a.m. the next morning, Lieutenant Dan Redding, the commanding officer of the South Atlanta Patrol Unit, summoned Theophilus Enda into his private office. The door was closed. The blinds were drawn. No witnesses. None of the usual camaraderie in the air. Only a conversation between the head of the unit and an officer now carrying the weight of a looming legal storm. "Do you know who she is?" Reading asked bluntly, without preamble. Enda, still in a crisply folded uniform, crossed his arms and tried to appear unfazed. Just a driver. Showed me a badge and expected a pass. Reading sighed. He didn't say another word. He simply turned the computer screen toward Enda. On it, a split-screen video was playing. On the left, footage from Enda's body comm. On the right, the video from Cheryl's phone. Two perspectives. One truth. Every motion slowed. Enda's hand hovering near his Glock 17 before Cheryl could finish her first sentence. The flashlight was glaring into her eyes, a voice not of warning, but of command. And on Cheryl's side, steady tone, firm posture, cooperative demeanor. She, Reading said, is Lieutenant Colonel Cheryl Acacia, logistics officer at Fort Moore, oversees supply chains for over 6,000 personnel, worked directly with FEMA during the Hurricane Katrina crisis in 2018. And you just wrote a citation for one of the cleanest service records in the U.S. military. Enda swallowed hard. For the first time in 15 years on the force, he had no immediate comeback, no joke, no rebuttal, just 17 seconds of prolonged silence. Reading continued, this time slowly and deliberately. And she didn't file alone. 3 departments have received the complaint, including the Office of the Federal Inspector General. From that moment, the fortress Enda believed would always shield him began to crack. The glances in the break room were no longer friendly. The officers who once clapped him on the back after shifts now gave cold nods. Rookies in the unit whispered, "Enda's being sued." Someone even quietly printed an internal bulletin titled, "Abuse of Authority in the Line of Duty, a Warning Sign." In the locker room, when Enda opened his locker to grab his jacket, he found a folded slip of paper wedged into the doorframe. No signature, just a single line written in blue ink. The camera doesn't lie. Even the smallest gestures were now scrutinized. When he poured milk into his coffee, a young officer muttered under his breath, "Maybe check with the lieutenant colonel first." A sarcastic jab, but loud enough to hear. The sense of invincibility that once cloaked Enda like an invisible shield was now peeling away piece by piece. And Cheryl? She said nothing to the media, posted nothing online. But at Fort Moore, she was sitting in a small conference room with 3 attorneys. One from the Army's Legal Affairs Office, another a constitutional law expert, and the third, Delaney Price, a former federal prosecutor with a win record exceeding 90% in civil rights violation lawsuits. Beside them sat a representative from JAG, the military's Department of Justice. No jokes, no small talk, no references to minor incidents. They were building a case, not only to defend Cheryl, but to send a message the system had long forgotten. Power without limits is dangerous. But even more dangerous is the power that believes it's untouchable. And Cheryl, the woman dismissed in the dead of night, was now leading the charge to return truth to its rightful place. Not with shouting, but with evidence, procedure, and unbreakable resolve. On the day the first hearing officially began, the skies over Atlanta were overcast, a gray ceiling hanging over the streets surrounding the Fulton County Civil Court, like an omen that a reckoning was quietly underway. There were no jostling reporters, no television cameras, but outside the courthouse, a group of about 17 uniformed soldiers stood scattered in small clusters, speaking quietly. Many were former colleagues of Cheryl Acacia. Some were her former students. One was a retired sergeant from Fort Moore, who had driven 4 hours from Columbus, Georgia, just to witness the day truth is restored. Cheryl entered through the side entrance reserved for plaintiffs. On her shoulders, the silver insignia of a lieutenant colonel glinting beneath the lobby lights. On her chest, 3 medals: the Meritorious Service Medal, the Combat Action Badge, and the Senior Military Leadership Award. Not worn to boast, but to remind that she had devoted nearly her entire life serving the very system that now demanded she prove her innocence. Across the courtroom, Officer Theophilus Enda sat back in a leather chair next to his attorney, Charles Brenner, a seasoned civil litigation lawyer. Enda wore a charcoal gray suit, his tie pulled so tight the veins in his neck bulged every time he swallowed. His eyes scanned the room, carefully avoiding the gaze of the uniformed individual seated behind the public gallery. When Judge Cynthia Morales entered and ascended to the bench, the entire room stood. A few eyes drifted toward Cheryl, the woman who had quietly ignited a legal earthquake with nothing more than a cell phone and an unshakable refusal to submit. Attorney Delaney Price, representing Cheryl, opened with an icy declaration. Your Honor, this is not a traffic stop case. This is a civil rights case. This is a vivid example of a law enforcement officer failing to uphold the very code he was sworn to, not due to oversight, but due to arrogance. The courtroom fell into silence. Brenner shifted in his seat. Cheryl was called to the witness stand. She stood, walked steadily as though reviewing a formation, her eyes locked on the testimony seat. She carried no notes, no documents. She recounted the incident in precise detail, each time stamp, each action. From the moment headlights forced her to pull over, to when she activated her camera, to the way Enda rested his hand on his weapon and ordered her out despite no sign of wrongdoing. The reason I turned on my camera, Cheryl said, her eyes fixed on the jury. Because silence has never been a shield, not for women of color, not on empty roads, and certainly not for those who've seen silence become someone's final moment. The jury didn't take notes. They simply looked up at her, each member. One by one, Delaney nodded. We present our evidence. 2 screens were turned on. One played footage from Cheryl's phone, the other from Enda's body cam. 2 angles, 1 conduct, 1 truth. The moment Enda approached the vehicle, without a greeting or explanation, the moment his hand hovered over the holster before Cheryl even moved, the moment he ordered a field sobriety test, despite her clear cooperation and alertness, and especially the slow-motion clip from his body cam showing her eyes, not fearful, but coldly composed, starkly contrasting with the unsteady command in his voice. What did she do wrong? One juror whispered to another. Delaney pointed to the screen. We all saw it. She did everything right, still treated as a suspect, because she didn't lower her eyes when she spoke. Finally, Cheryl was asked, if it hadn't been you, if it had been someone not in uniform, unfamiliar with procedure, without a phone, what do you believe would have happened? She looked directly at the judge, then turned back to the jury. That person might have been unlawfully detained. That person might not have lived to tell the story. I was lucky, but luck should never be the only thing protecting a citizen from those sworn to protect them. The words echoed through the entire chamber, and for the first time since the hearing began, Judge Morales placed her hand on the bench and gave a slight nod, not of agreement, but of acknowledgement that something greater than the law itself had just been laid bare before the court. After Cheryl Acacia finished her testimony, the courtroom remained enveloped in heavy silence, not for lack of things to say, but because her words had already etched themselves deep into everyone present. Yet the legal battle was far from over. Judge Cynthia Morales slowly turned the pen in her hand, her gaze signaling Attorney Delaney Price to proceed with cross-examination. Delaney stepped toward the podium, his voice calm but uncompromising. Lieutenant Colonel Acacia, during the entire situation that night, did you refuse any lawful order? No, Cheryl answered immediately, without hesitation. Did you resist when asked to step out of the vehicle? No. Did you exhibit any behavior that could be deemed provocative or dangerous? Number Y fully cooperated. I maintained a steady tone, didn't argue, and stood exactly where I was instructed. Delaney nodded. And when Officer Enda asked for your documents, did you provide them immediately? I presented my driver's license, vehicle registration, and my military ID. Did the ID clearly show your name and rank? Yes. It was a green card with the U.S. Army emblem, the words, U.S. Government Official, my name, and title, Lieutenant Colonel, Cheryl Acacia. Delaney turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not talking about an unidentified suspect in the middle of the night. We are talking about a high-ranking military officer who followed every legal procedure and was still treated like a potential criminal. The tension in the room stretched taut, like a drawn wire. Charles Brenner, defense attorney for Theophilus Enda, stood up to respond. He walked slowly, attempting to use a measured tone to diffuse the tension, but the strain was evident in every word. Lieutenant Colonel Acacia, is it possible that Officer Enda was simply following procedure to ensure public safety? Could it be that he feared you were tired or under the influence of medication? Cheryl didn't blink. I wasn't speeding. I stayed in my lane. There was no objective or subjective reason to assume that, except for the fact that I wasn't afraid of him. Brenner gave a tight smile. So you're saying Officer Enda's behavior stemmed from his authority being challenged? Exactly. I didn't raise my voice, but I didn't lower my head. And sometimes, to some people, that's the greatest offense. The courtroom stirred. A juror furrowed their brow while jotting something down. A soldier in the gallery folded his arms tighter. Brenner shifted direction. Do you believe police officers should have discretion in ambiguous situations? Yes, Cheryl said. But discretion cannot be separated from ethics. Judgment without accountability becomes instinct, and instinct can kill justice. The answer was like a clean blade, sharp and irrefutable. Even Judge Morales, known for her unshakable demeanor, paused her writing and looked at Cheryl for a long moment. She gave a slight nod. She said nothing, but her eyes said everything. I understand. Delaney returned to the table, leaving behind a courtroom that felt as though a new oath had just been spoken. But the tension did not subside. After a brief recess lasting just over an hour, the judge announced, "The court requests the defendant, Theophilus Enda, to take the stand." Enda rose, walking to the witness stand, as though his shoes had grown heavier. The ceiling lights caught the thin layer of sweat forming on his brow. He was no longer the defiant officer who had strutted out of a patrol car that night. Now, he was just a man trying to justify his actions before the law. When asked why he ordered Cheryl out of the vehicle, Enda replied, "She appeared uncooperative. I was concerned she might be unstable." "In what way was she uncooperative?" the prosecutor asked. "She asked why she was being pulled over," Enda replied. "You consider asking why a vehicle was stopped to be a threatening act?" The prosecutor's voice remained even, not mocking, but it cut to the core so precisely that the entire room understood the weight of the question. Enda was silent. "Did you know she was a lieutenant colonel in the military?" "No, not at that time." "And if you had known?" Enda looked down at the floor. His voice was lower now. "I might have handled it differently." No one in the courtroom laughed. They didn't need to. That answer alone was the indictment, the embodiment of the very mindset Cheryl was fighting against. 3 days after the final hearing, the atmosphere inside courtroom 4A of the Fulton County Civil Court was so silent that one could hear the wall clock ticking. each beat sinking deeply into the hearts of those present. There were no more heated arguments, no more defensive or hostile glances. Now, all that remained was waiting for justice to speak, and for the true nature of abused power to be exposed. Judge Cynthia Morales entered, carrying a file nearly 2 inches thick, the papers neatly clipped and marked with a yellow classification tab, a sign of rulings with exceptional circumstances. She looked around the room, where only about 20 people were present. A few military personnel, some curious citizens, 2 local reporters from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and 2 law students attending for observation. Cheryl Acacia sat upright, her hands resting lightly on her knees, her gaze fixed forward, but without any sign of anticipating victory. Her face made one thing clear. Whatever the outcome, it would not change the path she had chosen, not for fame, but for principle. 2 rows away, Theophilus Enda sat with his head bowed, his hands tightly clasped in his lap, eyes cast to the floor as if trying to avoid both light and truth. He no longer sought to resist, nor did he turn to his attorney, Brenner, for advice. He just sat there, like an empty fortress after an earthquake. Judge Morales opened the first page. Her voice was neither loud nor heavy, but each sentence landed like a verdict, echoing in the soul of every listener. In the case of Acacia versus Enda, after a 5-day trial based on testimonies, video evidence, and on-site conduct, the jury has concluded the plaintiff prevails. There was no applause, no whispers, only a single breath held back from the 3rd row, where a former Army sergeant quietly squeezed his wife's hand. The judge continued. The Atlanta Police Department, through the conduct of Sergeant Theophilus Enda, violated the constitutional rights of Lieutenant Colonel Cheryl Acacia, specifically the 4th Amendment, the right against unlawful search and seizure, and the 14th Amendment, the right to equal protection under the law. She turned to the next page, pausing for a few seconds with care. The court rules that the defendant's actions, including ordering the plaintiff to exit the vehicle without legal grounds, conducting an improper physical check, and issuing an invalid citation, constitute abuse of power and intimidation. As for damages, she said, the court orders the defendant to pay the amount of $35,000, which includes emotional distress, legal fees, and compensation for the plaintiff's interrupted work time. But that wasn't all. The judge lifted the documents. More importantly, Sergeant Enda's record of misconduct will be permanently stored in the internal ethics database of Georgia State Law Enforcement and simultaneously submitted to the U.S. Department of Justice and the National Police Conduct Oversight Board for appropriate disciplinary review. These were closing lines that could not be erased, a mark that would last for the rest of the life of a man who once thought himself immune to every judgment system. Cheryl did not cry, nor did she smile. She only nodded slightly, almost unconsciously, as if confirming to herself that the path she chose, despite its hardships and doubts, had indeed brought justice to where it belonged. Outside the courtroom hallway, as the session ended, a few reporters were already waiting. Enda exited through the side door, folding a document to cover his face. Cameras clicked rapidly, but he said nothing. No apology. No statement. A man who once believed his badge was a permanent shield now only wished to disappear into the gray brick wall behind him. Meanwhile, Cheryl paused at the auxiliary exit and opened her phone. A message popped up from Attorney Delaney. Verdict in your favor. Case closed. She closed the phone and took a deep breath. Not because she felt relief, but because she knew this was merely one victory in a far longer battle. Just 1 week after the verdict was announced, the Atlanta Police Department issued a brief internal statement. Sergeant Theophilus Enda will be temporarily suspended without pay pending the outcome of a disciplinary investigation by the city's Police Conduct Oversight Board. No detailed explanation was given, no official press conference. But within internal circles, everyone understood that this was far more serious than an administrative sanction. Rumors began to spread like lightning. Some said Enda would be demoted to observation officer. Others speculated he would be reassigned to logistics, away from any public contact. Some even believed he would have to surrender his badge entirely if the U.S. Department of Justice concluded the violation was severe enough. But the most important thing was not what would happen to Enda. It was that every gaze within the police station had changed. Young officers, especially those who had graduated less than 3 years ago, began to grow quieter. They reread the conduct protocols they had once skimmed over during training. A small group quietly reshared the internal link to the Code of Conduct and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Never in the past 12 years had the Atlanta Police Department's internal training portal seen such a surge in traffic in just 1 week. Squad meetings began, including a new item: self-assessment of field behavior. This had never been a mandatory requirement before. The Behavior Inspection Board, once merely a symbolic organization on paper, now began holding 3 meetings per week. A backlog of over 100 previously postponed complaints was brought back to the review table, and people started to realize one timely incident, with the right person and the right truth, could reverse a decade-long stagnation. Meanwhile, Cheryl Acacia returned to Fort Moore as if nothing had ever happened. No cameras, no media, no statements. That morning, she entered the logistics office with her familiar briefcase, sat in her chair, opened her computer, and resumed reviewing fuel supply chains for the Southeastern Military Transport Fleet. More than 12 interview requests from major networks like CNN, MSNBC, and PBS had arrived in her military inbox. Even an editor from The Atlantic had written a full-length piece calling her the woman who forced the system to look in the mirror. But none received a reply. When approached by the only reporter who managed to reach her and asked, "Why haven't you spoken out?" Cheryl simply responded, "Because I don't fight to be on camera. I fight so no one else has to stay silent the way I once did." Inside the base, the atmosphere had changed as well. Young officers whispered among themselves about the trial. They didn't know all the details, but just 2 words: Lieutenant Colonel Acacia, and the entire room would focus. One young soldier, only 21, after reading the internal bulletin on the lawsuit, stood up during a training session and said, "I used to think the law was something we enforced only on the battlefield. Now I realize, sometimes, it needs to be enforced at the city checkpoint too." Attorney Delaney Price met with Cheryl again during a post-trial document review session. She stated directly, "You could have asked for more. With your role, rank, emotional damage, and career consequences, you could have claimed at least $100,000. Cheryl didn't look up from the file, only replied gently, "I didn't do this for the money. If I win and the system doesn't change, that's a failure. Some leaders don't need to be on television. They don't need to shout in front of a crowd. They just need to stand firm, and their silence will echo longer than any speech." 2 months after the explosive lawsuit, Fort Moore launched its first ethics training program for the recruit class, 1221, a new initiative recently approved by the Southeastern Command after a series of lengthy meetings from the Pentagon to central bases. On the list of special instructors, the name Lieutenant Colonel Cheryl Acacia appeared, without any title except 3 words: guest speaker. The main hall, with a capacity of 380, was full this morning. Soldiers who had worn their uniforms for less than 6 weeks sat in straight lines, eyes focused. Many didn't know exactly who the woman about to step on stage was. They had only heard rumors. She's the one who won a lawsuit against a police officer without ever going on the news. Cheryl stepped onto the stage, her uniform pressed to perfection, silver rank on her shoulders, 2 distinguished service medals, and a Middle East campaign ribbon on her left chest. No background music, no introduction. Just a steady, calm, and clear voice. I won't be talking to you about tactics or how to coordinate logistics. I'm going to talk about silence. She didn't use slides. She didn't use complex jargon. Instead, she told a story about a night, a checkpoint, a headlight beam, and a voice giving orders for no reason. She didn't name names, didn't criticize anyone. She only described a look. It didn't see me as a human. It only saw an assumption. A young soldier raised his hand. "Lieutenant Colonel, then why didn't you fight back?" Cheryl smiled gently. I had 3 choices: scream, walk away, or document it. And I chose to document, because some battles can only be won by enduring. And endurance is not weakness, it's strategy. She explained how she handled the situation. Not a single act of resistance, no insults, no arguing. Only evidence. Only procedure. And in the end, just one goal: to change the system not for revenge, but to prevent it from happening to the next person. How many of you here think the uniform automatically earns you respect? Cheryl asked. About a third of the hands went up, slowly, hesitantly. She nodded. I understand. I used to think that too. But then I learned, respect is not a gift. It's a process. It comes from how you treat others, even when they don't deserve it. A young female soldier in the front row sat up straight, eyes brimming with tears. A white soldier in the middle row wrote furiously, never looking up. A former police officer turned serviceman sat in silence, his hands clasped tightly together. Cheryl continued, I'm not standing here because I won a lawsuit. I'm standing here because I know what happens if I do nothing. Justice, dear friends, doesn't come from weapons. It comes from resolve, from doing the right thing even when no one is watching. Before finishing, she said just one short sentence. A badge is not for abuse, it's for service. And if you don't wear it with discipline, you don't deserve to wear it. There was no applause, but the silence carried the weight of an oath. After the lecture, Cheryl walked off stage without a microphone, without signing autographs, without taking pictures. She left behind a new class of recruits, and a story that would follow them for the rest of their military lives. A week later, Fort Moore Training Center received requests from 7 other bases across the United States. We would like to invite Lieutenant Colonel Acacia to speak on leadership ethics. Not because she had won a trial, but because she was living proof that true leadership doesn't require shouting, only steadiness and silence. And from then on, people began calling her by a simpler name. The woman who didn't need to raise her voice to change the whole system. The case between Lieutenant Colonel Cheryl Acacia and Officer Theophilus Enda was not just a civil trial. It was a wake-up call for anyone who ever believed that a badge was a permanent shield. It raised a question that society must confront. Are we granting power without checking character? When a woman chooses silence and follows due process, when she doesn't need to shout yet still transforms the system, then it's no longer a personal story, but a symbol of justice's steadfast strength. In a noisy and biased world, perhaps it is principled silence that makes abusers tremble the most. And if Cheryl hadn't been a lieutenant colonel, would she have been heard at all? What do you think? Does justice depend on rank and title, or on how we act when no one is watching? If you want to keep following stories that inspire, expose injustice, and honor inner strength. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for Black Strength stories so you won't miss our next powerful story.